Well, I'm with Angela Voss today. It's great to see you again, Angela.
Great to be here.
Yeah, because I think when I came here in 2004, you were on the staff here in Religious Studies.
That's right, yes. Yeah.
And you're now at Christchurch.
So I'm now in the education faculty at Christchurch Uni, yeah.
Yeah, and you've been in Canterbury how long?
Well, I've been in this area since about 1997 or 98, I think, in and around Canterbury. And then I started working here at Kent Uni very part-time in about 1998, I think, about 20 years ago. And I was here until 2010. And then in 2013, I started at Christchurch with a similar sort of programme that I was teaching here. Yeah, so I've been there 4 years now.
Yeah. And often when I'm on my travels in Lampeter, for example, you're, well, maybe your name directly, but certainly the programme that you're teaching comes up. I think there's a good network, isn't there, around the country of cosmology and divination.
Yes. So I now direct a programme called an MA in Myth, Cosmology and the Sacred at Canterbury Christchurch. And in its previous incarnation here, it was called MA in the Cultural Study of Cosmology and Divination, which I've been kind of teaching and working on for many, many years with my colleague Geoffrey Cornelius. And it's quite a unique programme, so it is actually now getting quite well known everywhere because there's nothing else like it anywhere as far as I know. And it kind of combines a study of esoteric wisdom traditions, spiritual traditions, religious experience with transformative learning and a reflexive approach to learning. So it's not just learning about text and traditions, it's actually students also going into quite a lot of depth in terms of their own experience and their own processing of information, their own spiritual paths, their own imaginations.
Because there's often a big talk about the subjective turn or the turn to the self. And we were saying just before we started recording that in my own case, my own training, if you like, was very much dealing with sources and texts. You would never put yourself into your own, say, PhD. The thought of autobiographicalising something like that was unheard of 20 odd years ago. But yes. I think the goalposts are changing, and I think there's much more of the reflection on why are you doing this? What is that project doing? And in a way, bringing in oral testimony, I guess, similar perhaps to what we're doing in these interviews, is taken more seriously.
Definitely, and in subjects like anthropology, particularly, where there's a lot of ethnographic research now. And also in education, we've been very encouraged by being in education because their methodologies are so broad and there are so many different kinds of transpersonal and transformative research methodologies, such as intuitive methodologies, somatic methodologies, organic methodologies. I mean, there's so much which is focused on bringing one's own self and creativity into the research. So having found that, found all those methodological possibilities and combining that with study of religion and religious experience and spirituality is actually proving to be a very powerful mixture for people because obviously spiritual experiences are very, very deep and very important for people, and to be able to really contact that level in their research whilst also looking at the text and traditions is just proving to be very popular and enriching and nourishing for students. And because we do it very rigorously in an academic way and get very good reports from the external examiners and very good student testimonials, Christchurch seem to be okay. They seem to be quite enjoying it, I think. I hope.
Yeah. We'll talk in a minute about how you I think got into this, but, and it sounds like that's a bit. Yes. But going back a little bit first, tell me a bit about your upbringing. Where and when you were born.
Okay, so I was born a long time ago.
So, this is how, when you mentioned that you had myth in the title of your programme, I think you're embodying that with the answer you just gave.
Quite a long time ago. I was born in Chiswick, and I lived in Ashford, Middlesex. As I grew up, I went to Ashford County Grammar School. I'm an only child. My mother was a nurse, a district nurse, and my father was actually an artist, but his main profession was an electrical engineer at the airport. But he did art all his life, and when he took early retirement, he became a full-time artist and art teacher.
Well, I can see where you get that talent from, because we were just talking about something that you posted on Facebook the other day from when you were a teenager. And I mean, from my point of view, this was a work of professionalism and skill. And you said, no, it was just a teenage drawing, but it was like Renaissance women.
Well, I was a very unusual teenager, because about the ages of 15 or 16, I became completely obsessed by the Renaissance period, particularly the music. And I used to drag my parents off to country houses every weekend, because I was just so enraptured by the history and the architecture and the furniture and the costumes and the people. And I discovered Renaissance music, and I was a musician anyway. I played the violin and piano, and it just opened up a whole kind of world of something I just found enchanting, entrancing, very deeply moving. And I enjoyed drawing anyway, and I just started drawing all sorts of extraordinary sort of things. Like I would devise a whole kind of country house and make a plan of it and start drawing all the generations of the people who lived there. And I would draw sort of Renaissance angels and musicians, and yes, I think the picture you're referring to was a drawing of the sort of the Assumption of the Virgin, which is extraordinary because my parents were completely non-religious and I didn't have any kind of religious upbringing at all. But I was obviously becoming quite intrigued by all these things as a teenager.
Yeah. And did you think that a career in art, along the lines of what your father did, was something that you were going to follow through?
No, I wanted a career in music. So I studied music mainly at university. I did a combined arts course, but music was my main subject. And I went to Leicester University because that's where they had quite a strong emphasis on early music. And my tutor there was also expert in sort of early music, and also I could do music as part of a combined course with other subjects. So yeah, I really wanted to be a musician more than anything else.
But did you feel then that the friends that you had were doing very different things? But certainly when I was growing up, we were sort of locked in a world sometimes of, compared to what you were doing, very sort of low culture, really. But it sounds like what you're doing is so inspiring, actually.
So I was lying on the sofa with headphones listening to Monteverdi when all my friends were at discos. Yeah. I mean, I was really unusual in that respect, I think. I was never interested in pop music. Not until my son sort of introduced me to it much later. Yes, I think I was quite an intellectual teenager, and I just became very, very focused on the period between sort of 1500 and 1700 in terms of art, music, culture.
What do you think inspired that?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, the immediate answer in terms of listening to music, I remember, was watching on television The Six Wives of Henry VIII. This was also on the radio, David Munro and the Early Music Consort. So this was right back in the early 70s probably. And it was just something about the quality of that music that awoke me to something. Now, if you believe in past lives, you can imaginatively. I can imaginatively think of myself back in, Florence in sort of the late 15th century. I just feel I've got a very strong affinity with that place and that time, and I can't say where it's come from. Really, it certainly hasn't come from my parents or any kind of family influence.
No, because when you mentioned that you were taking your parents around country houses, I have a memory of being dragged around places that I didn't want to go to, but it was...
Yeah, my dad used to sit in the car reading newspapers, and used to get my mum. She was quite interested.
That is interesting, though, because I sometimes worry that my tastes were a little bit sort of too lowbrow, but I think the nostalgia interest is also a way of me going back to that period and thinking what else was going on at the time, almost to corroborate and contextualise it, maybe almost to justify it. So rather than just say that, yes, I used to, watch carry-on films or something, or listen to the charts, it's just trying to find some more meaning in that about, what else was happening at the time, what was that sort of undergirding. And for me, I don't necessarily want to have simply memories of just almost being passive, of putting the radio on and something being there. And I think that's probably why now I do lots of cinema trips, and it's almost sort of, and it's very much by choice. It's not just a case of randomly going to something. I'll decide, I'll travel as far as I need to go to do that, but it feels that I'm in control of that. It's not just a case of just sampling or imbibing whatever's close at hand. There has to be an effort, almost a pilgrimage or a ritual involved in that process. But it sounds as though the sort of things that maybe I'm now doing in middle age, you were already grappling with as a teenager.
Well, I certainly knew what I liked, knew what I wanted, and knew what I wanted to do. And I think a lot of my friends now are quite surprised at how focused I am. It's almost like, I did have a sense that I really wanted to be a musician, and I played music throughout my 20s, and I worked with various musical groups. But then I think in my late 20s I started feeling I wanted to go back to academic work because I wanted to study in more depth. Well, basically what had happened in my 20s is that I had discovered this Renaissance philosopher called Marsilio Ficino, and it was one of those sort of meetings which I think a lot of people feel they have with historical characters, where they kind of feel they come alive and they know them almost. They feel such a strong sort of sympathy with them. So that's what set me off on this very focused journey, really, was discovering the work of Ficino, who was an extraordinary Renaissance philosopher who practiced a form of astrological music therapy. So I was also learning astrology in my 20s and playing lots of music and immersed in the Renaissance. So when I discovered him and his work, again, something sort of woke up, and I thought, right, I really want to study him in more depth. And I realised that there was no real scholarly work about how he used astrology as part of his philosophical teaching and work, because at that time, it's getting a bit better now, but at that time, sort of back in the late 80s, it was sort of embarrassing for scholars to take astrology seriously as a practice. So that's what impelled me to do an MA and then a PhD on him and his work. And that's what sort of, has sort of guided me, really, ever since. And led me to want to devise these postgraduate programmes around this kind of working intuitively, creatively and imaginatively, as in symbolic interpretation with astrology and other forms, but also, in a deeply sort of scholarly way. So to cross this gulf, to cross this bridge that was I was finding between the academic studies and the practices. And then I've been very focused about that and just known that it's what I wanted to do. And apart from a little gap where I had my two sons, I've just focused quite single-mindedly on this project, and people are quite surprised that I kind of knew what I wanted to do and focused on it quite early.
I remember when I started doing my PhD, my supervisor said that the best scholarly work is often at the intersection between disciplines. And so I was somebody who had a background in theology, but and actually his field was the methodology of religion. So that was different for me, because he didn't come from any sort of confessional or theological background. It was very much the study of religion, very much the Ninian Smart model, actually. And then I was looking at film, which was new to him. He did do some work in media, but not really in film. So I was learning a lot. Both the methodological and the work on film was something that I was learning effectively on the job, as it were. And I think what you're saying is similar in terms of the way that you were trying to bring together pursuits, perhaps one academic, one very creative, but which weren't perhaps in an academic context really being fused.
Yes. Yeah, I think I've always had a sense that it's important to not, for these two ways of understanding the world, whatever we want to call them, rational, intuitive, whatever, to find a way of coming together in studying and scholarship. I've always had an immense problem with having two lives. I mean, a lot of academics I know, or read, quite obviously have two lives. They have an academic life where they feel they have to write like this, they have to think like this, they have to be very detached, and this other life where all sorts of amazing things happen, And everybody has, the amount of stories I've had from people since I've been doing this work about extraordinary experiences they've had, kind of supernatural experiences, psychic experiences, whatever you like to call it, and that's one compartment, and their academic work is another compartment. And I've never felt this is appropriate. I always felt that it's not. If one can integrate, these deep experiences with the writing and the thinking, the scholarship, you're actually kind of raising consciousness in some way, because you're creating a third possibility of integration, so you're not just remaining sort of split apart.
It's like a quest for authenticity as well, isn't it? Because I often worry that at different times only certain facets of me, certain persona, are coming across, that when you're teaching, you have to wear a particular hat. And sometimes you may be teaching a course that it could be your own syllabus, but it could be one that you're teaching because, if you weren't teaching it, somebody else would be. So there are certain no-go areas. It's the students want to be taught and you have a rubric and it's your job to teach that. But sometimes that's not enough, and there are other ways of disseminating yourself. I mean, some people are rightly very private, but there's also a part of me that I think likes to be able to say sometimes, well, I'm on a journey, I'm studying for a particular reason, there are certain reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing, and sharing that is part of that objective. The idea that you can be studying something and not give away the reasons for that passion. Why did you choose this subject and not another? It's a need to justify, but in a good way. In other words, if you're going to say to a class of students, and if they're going to be paying money to do a course, sometimes being able to say, this is my rationale, this is who I am, can be important in terms of making them think, okay, now I understand that, because I know what the impact is on you. They can follow you rather than just think you're imparting information that I don't really want to learn. That was the problem at school sometimes. Of course, teachers who tell you what to learn, but they don't explain what the pleasure is or the rationale behind that. It's just, if you learn it, you'll do well. If you don't, you'll be in trouble. And for me, education has to be more than that.
Like that. And I think, because we're doing postgraduate courses for mainly mature students, we get groups of amazing individuals, who've already done a huge amount in their lives and in many ways are far more expert than we are in all sorts of areas. So it's much more like a shared journey together. It's not... I mean, when I was here at Kent, I taught some undergraduate programmes, and that was very, very different. That was definitely more of a struggle to find a way of presenting this material in a way that they could react to in a much more internalised way as well, because they weren't used to, the 18, 19-year-olds just were not used to revealing themselves in that way or thinking about things in this way, because they've been taught to do things through the sort of school system. But a few of them, when they realised what we were doing, just found it very exciting and sort of, and some of them really did respond to it very enthusiastically, because others just wanted to regurgitate facts. But nevertheless, I kind of feel it was an interesting exercise teaching this material with undergraduates.
There are some students who obviously, and quite rightly, want to get good grades, they want to get the degree, they have a job maybe in mind. So for them it's jumping through various hoops. But there are some for whom, and the two don't have to be distinct, but there will be some who will say, well, I'm here because this is literally a life and death case, because I teach on death and the afterlife. But sometimes it's, they're there because they really want to know about this. And it might come from personal experiences, maybe the loss of a family member or a faith, or maybe they simply just know that these are not the sort of questions that come up sufficiently in a day-to-day context, and to study this, it's a real thrill. And they will, I'd like to think, look back in a few years' time and think, I did that, and it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
Well, of course, like that, Chris. The fact is, who hasn't got an interest in what's going to happen after we die? It's one of the most fundamental, probably the most fundamental existential question that we could ask ourselves. So, to not go into that sort of level of kind of addressing those deep fears or those deep connections with this material and what it brings up, I think would be, how can you treat that sort of material just, in a kind of detached, rational way? It's
yes, because if you're looking at near-death experiences, you're citing testimony from people who've had a life-changing experience as a result, and in every case it's that they never returned to the life that they had before, or at least they may have physically returned to it, geographically returned to it, but they often have a renewed sense that death is not something to be feared, and I think that sort of testimony is something that it's hard not to be struck by, it's hard not to be inspired by.
Absolutely. We always encourage the students, whether they're doing with their researchers or on the MA programme, to maybe find their way into their essays through their own experiences. So, to actually choose an essay title because there's something there that resonates with some very deep experience they've had or a question they've got that they really want to grapple with, and they can start their whole essay, with this, well, I had this amazing experience, when I saw this strange thing in the sky or whatever, and then that leads into, well, how can we begin to understand the UFO phenomena, for example? I think if they lead in that sort of way, then it starts opening up the dialogue between, their sort of what it meant for them, the meaning making, the hermeneutic level of it.
Yeah, I think I still have that binary though. I think I must do, because when I'm writing on nostalgia now, I write in a very formal way. I cite lots of sources, but that's my training. But then my diary, or even perhaps these interviews, are a way of, maybe seminars as well with the students. In the lecture, I'm very conscious that I'm delivering conceptual material. That is the objective. I need to do that, but it's not just a case of saying, tell me about your life story, because that's not what the module is predicated on. But that said, it's hard not to have a personal testimony angle to what is being looked at. But for me, in my writing, I do find that I'm either writing an academic piece or I'm writing something that is in some way so personal, of course, it cannot be disseminated. It's in the form of a diary, which maybe sometimes is why I might go on Facebook and do a video post before I give a lecture on, say, near-death experiences. And I've done that before. I tried it out because I was so looking forward to delivering this material. I just said to my friends on Facebook, this is what I'm going to be doing for the next couple of hours. When I came out of the lecture, there were like 30 or 40 likes, and people were actually saying, I remember studying that at university, and that was really inspirational. And I realised I'd touched the nerve, because what came out was not just, I'm about to teach for the next 2 hours, but I'm teaching on something that for a lot of people was the most memorable experience that they had 30 years ago, 20 years ago, when, like me, they studied perhaps in Lampeter, where there were colleagues like Paul Badham who taught this material. And I was fortunate enough to be able to go on to do an MA on death and immortality. And then the book that I wrote on life after death a few years ago through film was clearly predicated on that background. So it's lovely when it comes full circle.
Yeah.
Well, you've already said what you very much enjoyed doing as a child. And actually, one of my questions, which of course I'm not going to ask now, is about the music, the charts of the time, because I think that probably is something that maybe your friends at the discos could answer that. We'll try them. But what about, you went to university and you studied music, but did you then pursue a PhD straight afterwards, or was there a gap period? Yeah,
there was a gap between the ages of 21 and 27. When I was in London, just had various odd jobs, trying to play music most of the time. And the nicest job I had was working as a kind of admin assistant for an early music group called the Consort of Music, run by Anthony Rooley and Emma Kirkby, who's still very much around singing. And that was great, because that was a part-time job, and I was just surrounded by music a lot of the time, and everything I was doing was to do with early music. And then about when I was 27, I found out about an MA programme in music performance at the City University, which seemed absolutely ideal, because it was partly performance and partly writing dissertation. You had to do a performance, a dissertation, and a music editing project. So I decided to do that. And I did, there was a recital on the Brock violin, and I also wrote, that's when I started writing about Ficino and his music for the dissertation aspect. And after that, I thought, well, I just want to carry on, really. So in those days, it was quite easy to get grants to do PhDs, because I got a first-class degree, and it was quite easy to get a grant. So
not in my day.
No.
I was told that, actually. I was said, oh, you're guaranteed to get British Academy funding. I didn't.
It was DES funding in those days. So I just carried on at the City University, and I had to do a PhD then. So I was doing a PhD until I finished when I was 35.
Where did you do that?
So that was still at City. I was still at City University, but I did most of my research at the Warburg Institute in London. I had a sort of nominal supervisor at City, but he didn't really know much about the subject, so I had most of my help from the Warburg Institute. I finished that in 1992. Yeah, it took quite a long time. It was one of those, well, as everyone who does a PhD knows, it was one of those projects where you feel like throwing it out of the window, kind of don't know if you're ever going to manage to finish, but I did.
For me, it's often year-based. I can remember 1996 being a bit of a desolate year. I didn't feel things fell into place. The following year, it very much did. And I think everyone goes through that period, and I associate it with the weather. I think in '96, I think of the rain, even though I know that there was sunshine that year, and it's really funny. Well, I probably guilt sometimes that I was probably in my room or out on a bus somewhere, probably going to the cinema and thinking I should be writing my PhD. So I remember having the umbrella and leaving it in a pub somewhere or whatever. But it's I think you're right. I think when there's a project that's so personal, you're bound to have struggles. I mean, there are some people who will say that yes, I enrolled on a program and I simply started writing and I produced all the work. I mean, I had a supervisor who was brilliant, really, because he didn't say, Chris, I want you to write 8,000 words by next Friday or something like that. He effectively said, give me whatever you want when you want to. And of course, that made me work harder because rather than being prescriptive, I kept thinking, maybe he's expecting work from me. And I didn't want to have an embarrassing encounter whereby we were both avoiding the obvious subject, like, why haven't you submitted any work? But if anything, I went the other way. And I think he'd sometimes see me coming down the corridor and I'd have a sheaf of papers in front of me. And I could see the look on his face, like, because I think he was very good at turning work around quickly. But obviously there were busy periods with marking when he may have had other priorities. And I would sometimes hand him work, and I was conscious that I was probably taking up some of his time. But he was amazing because he let me flourish on my terms, and he wasn't somebody who had to prod me. If anything, I was the one initiating all the contact. But he always read the work and he gave me excellent and detailed feedback, and I think that helped me get through it and find my own voice and find my own feet, because I wanted to please. I didn't want to let him down and let my parents down, because they were obviously helping me financially and emotionally, and let myself down as well, that I could justify my reason for doing it and not, inverted commas, having a job.
Yes.
Because I was very, very conscious that people would say, where are you working, what are you doing? And I'd say I was doing a PhD, and they'd say, an eternal student then, and that used to make me feel a little bit
my dad was a bit like that.
Concerned.
Yeah. Yes, I think I could have done with more support, really, in terms of when I think of the kind of structure that the students are given at Uni Network, particularly at Christchurch, this sort of 6-month review and the monthly supervision and the work. I mean, it's all so structured, and I didn't have any of that. I was basically just left on my own for 6 years with the odd meeting with the supervisor just to get on with it and do it. And I just had to, and it was quite difficult. And then when it came to the Viva, I kind of feel that the gods were with me then, because I had occasionally been in my supervisor's office in tears with this whole project, feeling I just can't do it, but somehow I had. And it got to the Viva, and my external examiner was suddenly ill and couldn't come. And it was quite obvious that the internal examiners hadn't read it properly and were going to be, wanting to rely on the external examiner. And he'd just sent in a few questions for them to ask. And I could tell that they were hadn't really read it properly. So suddenly, after this sort of 6 years of struggle, I had this Viva, which was just like, half an hour of just easy chat and well, that's fine, you've kind of got the PhD. And it was such an easy ending after the 6 years of struggle. When I think about how other people's Vivas can be, because I didn't even have my external examiner there. And it was just, I just kind of sailed through it, and it was extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds, if anything, almost anticlimactic, because
yes,
because I know a lot of people worry, and rightly so, because there's a lot riding on it. But for me, in a positive way, because if you've been investing a lot of personal energy, then of course there's nothing more devastating than to be told you've been on the wrong path, although you could then in that case say, well, hang on, why did my supervisor let me persevere? And of course in your case it sounds as though you could have had a supervisor who wasn't perhaps giving you as much support as you would have liked, and therefore there was no guarantee that the Viva was going to go well. But in my case, I treated it as though my life was on the line, that I gave full answers to the questions. I was certainly nervous, but I also thought this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to be able to answer questions somebody who has, read the thesis, because I'm used to people stopping me in the street and saying, "What are you studying?" And of course, you flummox them, because you can't give the same sort of answers in the street that you might do if you're sitting, with the Viva in front, with the thesis in front of you in a formal environment. So I thought, this is my natural habitat. I'm gonna go to town on this, and I was the expression "defending a thesis." I felt that's what I was doing, but I felt very defensive. But I was on edge. But it probably got the best out of me, and I was treating it like every answer was going to make that difference. And I think in reality they decided beforehand, but I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And even if I had, it didn't matter, because I still had to go through that process.
Yeah.
Couldn't be, how can you be complacent about something that has been your life?
Yeah.
And then for me afterwards, and it'd be interesting to see what you say in relation to this, what you then do, because my mistake, I think, was after I'd got the PhD, I thought, well, I've now effectively qualified as an expert in religion and film. So I felt that rather than move on to something completely new, I was largely beholden to that same paradigm. It took me a while, some years really, before I started branching out and doing other things. It was almost as though I thought everything from now on for the rest of my career has to be in this sort of area, because I have the unique, the privilege of being somebody who can claim that this is what he's a master of. But in your case, what then happened once you got the PhD?
Well, of course, what I was doing was so interdisciplinary. I was doing it in a music department, but it was more about Renaissance philosophy, really. It was more about history of esoteric traditions. It was more about classical philosophy through into the Renaissance, as well as about the practices of astrology and music. Very interdisciplinary. As soon as I finished the PhD, I wasn't thinking in terms of getting a career, because I was 35 and I think I just had a biological drive at that point that I've spent like 7 or 8 years studying now. I want to have a family. That's all I could think of at that point. And I think when you have a very strong desire for something, you attract it in some way. And I was lucky enough at that time to have met my now ex-husband. Who also wanted to settle down and have children. So that was just the obvious thing to do next. So when I was 35, I moved out of a wonderful house in Golders Green that I've been sharing with other musicians. I moved in with him and I had 2 children very quickly, and so spent 5 years really being a mum. But then what happened to kind of kickstart the next bit of my career was actually meeting Leon. So it was our dear colleague Leon, who I met in London when we were living in London, and my children were very little. A friend of mine who was a Jungian therapist called Julianne McLean organised a discussion group at her house, and someone suggested I might like to go along to this discussion group because they talked about philosophy and religion and various things. And 2 of the people that went to that discussion group were Leon and Joseph Milne, who taught here on the MA in Mysticism and Religious Experience. So I went along to the discussion group, and it was a great, great group, and I met them. And after sort of getting to know them a bit, I heard about the programme they taught here, which was the MA in Mysticism and Religious Experience, which ran very successfully for many years. Leon said, "Well, if you come down to Kent, you could teach a module on Ficino for this MA programme." In those days, it seemed remarkably easy just to kind of go into a programme and teach a module. I mean, not so now. So that's what actually started everything, because we moved out of London, moved down to Kent. The boys started at nursery and school and things. So I had a bit of time, and I came here and taught a module on Ficino for the MA in Mysticism, and that's how I got a foot into this. So in both here and at Christchurch, I've just been incredibly lucky, because I've never had to go through a job interview process. I've never had to define myself in terms of a discipline. I've sort of just been in the right place at the right time. And then, as you probably know, when we were here, and my colleague Geoffrey had also moved to Herne Bay, so he was in the vicinity, and he started doing a bit of teaching for the Mysticism MA. And after a couple of years of doing part-time teaching here, we were suddenly given this huge amount of money from the Sophia Trust. to start incorporating more modules on cosmology and divination, first of all within the mysticism MA, and then to start our own MA programme. And because we had this large sum of money coming in, and I was just sort of sitting here already ready to do this programme, I was funded to be part-time and then full-time. So again, I didn't have to go through any, I was just here, and the money just arrived. And I always think this is just, when I see what some of my colleagues have to do, and the sort of, trying to get jobs and what the academic world is like, I just think, wow, this is just amazing that this just sort of happened. And the same thing happened at Christchurch. I met an amazing woman called Wilma Fraser, who in the education faculty was determined to get the MA going there after it finished here. And again, I was just in the right place at the right time, and we got the students, and I'm sort of funded to run the programme. So I just feel there's been something looking after me. I got onto a kind of thread of what I really wanted to do, what was my passion, and the doors opened, starting with Leon.
Mm. And actually Leon, I think, as we were saying just before we started recording, was indirectly an influence on these interviews, because it's when he sadly passed away, 3 years ago now. I remember at his funeral finding that I knew so little about him. I thought I knew him well as a colleague, we all do. But then I realised that there was this hinterland, and I wish I'd explored that with him. His wider musical interest, and his and when his son was talking about the some of his own faith issues growing up, and I just thought I wish I'd had those conversations with him. And part of me, I think, has indirectly led to these interviews. It's almost a way of ensuring that you don't have to wait for somebody to pass away before you can get to know something about their life story, but actually hear their life story told in their own words, rather than necessarily filtered through someone else.
It's such a wonderful idea.
But although I've also found, though, that it's got nothing to do with age, that everyone has a compelling narrative, whether they're 25 or 75, and I think for me this interview series would be something good to sort of process and answer that question. Do you have to be old to be nostalgic? There's a lot of work in psychology in that area. Do undergraduates have nostalgic experiences? And I did ask my students this question once, and they were all talking about the film Mean Girls, which is not my generation at all. And I thought, somebody could do a research project on that. But I think that's really inspiring. And Leon had a huge number of particularly international students who would come over and really imbibe that mysticism MA, which was flourishing around the time I came here in 2004.
It was really flourishing, and I think its strength again was that it was beginning to sow these seeds of being more reflexive. I mean, although it didn't explicitly embrace these sort of methodologies that we're now able to do at Christchurch through the transformative learning, it wasn't explicitly saying we are doing transformative learning, but it was implicitly doing transformative learning, because it was very concerned with the students' own experiences and paths. But it was much more difficult here, and with the MA we did too, it was much more difficult to fully consciously embrace the reflexive method, because we felt we were going against the grain all the time, and also, as you probably remember, there was a lot of hostility towards what we were doing, and misunderstandings and just complete, really knee-jerk reactions to it. So it's actually thriving a lot better where we are now.
Yeah. And when you were studying, or indeed when you were teaching, I'm always interested in this sort of sense of the wider tapestry, the things that inspire us. And you see this sometimes on sites like Facebook, where people will reveal a lot about themselves, their politics, their faith, which you don't necessarily know about, and you sometimes think that's interesting. Again, like I was saying, at somebody's funeral, you sometimes think I didn't know that they had those sort of interests. But in your case, because obviously spirituality has been a big part of your life, but did those interests, those passions, I don't know if you would call it faith, but has that changed or mutated over time?
So that's really interesting, and I get asked quite a lot, what my spiritual path is, and do I have one? Well, as I said, I came from a family who were completely disinterested, so there was no interest in either of my parents really on anything religious, spiritual. I think I went to Sunday school just because my friends did. My mother was very artistic, and she loved poetry. She loved the imagination, but no sort of faith sense in any of my family at all. Atheists, probably they would call themselves. But my father had a friend who would occasionally come round to the house, who was a very interesting man, who was he was interested in all sorts of things I would now probably call more interested in sort of like consciousness and sort of paranormal events and the weird sort of outreaches of human nature and possibilities in a way that my parents were, they were very conservative. It was like a sort of, when he would come around to talk about these things to me, it was like this breath of fresh air, and I thought, wow, there's a whole kind of realm of human potential that is just completely beyond what I'm being taught at school and what my parents are telling me. And I can remember he particularly awakening me to something, and I don't know quite what it was, but it was some other potential of human being and knowing. So that's, I think, started something off. And then I think it was through the most powerful musical experiences that I had a sense of something transcendent and something beyond the normal everyday.
Perhaps.
The numinous, definitely the numinous. And I knew there was something, some other realm of being experienced that was not humdrum and everyday. And I got there through music. But then when I discovered Ficino, when I discovered Renaissance philosophy, and when I discovered Plato, I started. So in fact, I had a very profound experience at uni when I was doing a year of classical studies, and we read Plato's Allegory of the Cave, which of course everybody sort of knows, I expect, which of course I'd never read before, never read any Plato before. That was an awakening experience, because suddenly I realised that yes, what I'd been glimpsing a bit earlier in my earlier life was the world beyond the cave, and there was a world beyond the cave, and that was this liberating experience, and that then combined with what I found in Ficino, who was working with Platonic philosophy, obviously translated entire works of Plato and Neoplatonists, I became deeply immersed in Platonic philosophy. I became deeply immersed in the Neoplatonists and Plotinus and Iamblichus, and that was my path. I realised then I'd found my path, that Neoplatonic philosophy did it for me. It absolutely gave me a sort of rational framework for transcendent experience. It gave me a rational framework for being able to bring together, these deep kind of experiences of moving to this other place, with understanding how you can put that into a concept or into a kind of map. Because that's what Neoplatonic philosophy is. I think it's a kind of map of giving us a sense how we are two. We are both a divine being and we are a human being, and we have to find a way in our life of bringing these two things together. So that would be my part. And then I would say, the practice of astrology also feeds into that, because one of the main aspects of Neoplatonism is working with symbols. It's understanding that the symbolic and the metaphoric, the mythic, point you towards this transcendent place, not just the rational mind alone. So working with astrology as a symbolic system of the cosmos, I've found it's a key. It's really like a key to unlocking that other way of knowing, where you can, transcend the limits of the rational mind and start sort of participating in something bigger than you are. So that, I would say, with a Gnostic with a small g, is my path. And I definitely have, and I know that this is something that I've been working on for quite a long time, a bit of an issue with a sort of what I would see a bit of a reduction to a sort of literalism of particular faiths, because I'm always trying to work towards a position that is beyond all particular expressions, and what are all these particular expressions pointing to. So this sort of, when one gets stuck in a bit of a sort of fundamentalist position, in a particular faith way, and you're trying to point towards a symbolic, I think this is a kind of struggle that is typified in the sort of pagan Christian issue. And it's very interesting that we now find ourselves at Christ Church, which is a Christian foundation, with a strong kind of chapel and dean, whatever, and we're bringing in this other way of thinking, seeing, And I think it's part of a much bigger historical issue.
Well, so something that has stuck in my mind since Leon's funeral, where he was asked, wasn't he, when he, before he died, before he had an operation, what his faith was, and
Yes.
it was a tick box exercise,
Yes.
and apparently he answered, was it no religion and all religions? Yeah. And that seems to be what you're
that's what I would
touching
probably,
it.
yeah.
What did your parents make of that then? Because when you were on this, I call it a journey,
yes.
but it was very different to their own. Were they very, very supportive? Were they surprised? Did they find that you were going somewhere that did they understand what you were doing?
No, they didn't really understand, and I didn't really talk to them about it. I mean, my father had a lot of problems with the fact that I didn't get a really good job as soon as I left university, and my father had a lot of issues, and I think he had a lot of resentment towards his own family in a way that I never really got to understand, and it came out as a sort of quite a lot of anger towards me for not following the kind of path he thought I should follow, i.e. I get a good degree, I should therefore join the BBC or something instead of just playing music and just trying to do this and that. So when he kind of died very suddenly in 1989, before I'd resolved anything with him, and because I think he was probably a bit dyslexic, and he was definitely not an intellectual. He was a hands-on person, an artist. He really didn't understand at all what I was trying to do. I think my mum did a bit more, but I don't know. There was something very deep in me that I felt that neither of them could really grasp or really get, and in that sense my relationship with both of them was very pragmatic, and I didn't really sort of touch these sort of deeper things with them, but I found a whole circle of colleagues and friends who I could share this with, who I would regard as my kind of soul family in a way, and I still do, because they're the ones who do understand, and I can share it all with.
I mean, there is something almost like, mythological. You go on an adventure, you go to university, for example, and you study something, but you're never the same person when you return. I mean, it's the Wizard of Oz story, really, isn't it? But there's no place like home, but you come back renewed, refreshed, in a different way. And I always used to think, when I had friends who went to university but then returned afterwards, and they went back to live with their parents, which is something I didn't do, and in some cases they may have worked for their parents, but they took a very conventional path. I mean, I've done that in many ways. I went to Lampeter and I stayed in Lampeter, did all my degrees there. I'm somebody who, once I found a particular niche, find that something works, I find it difficult to get out of that groove. But for me, going back and almost sort of becoming or returning to the teenager, for me, would have been a regressive step. I knew that I needed, even if it meant staying in the same place where I went to university, for me, that was the right trajectory to be on. And my parents have been amazingly supportive, but who would have thought 25 years ago that I'd end up doing what I'm doing now? I mean, they didn't go to university. It wasn't as though it was, expected that I would follow a particular path. Getting to university was amazing enough, let alone staying. And I spent more than half my life working in this sector, but that's the exciting thing, that you never know. The soul does grow, and I think that you come into contact with people. Sometimes they dazzle you, and there are good people and not so good people who inspire you, or in some cases may set you on a less creative path. But it's knowing how to navigate your way around that, and sometimes it is only life experience. And there comes a point when you can't necessarily go back to your parents or, and say, what is the answer to this? Sometimes you have to frame the question and answer it yourself, but often with the support of family and other members. But that's something that I think everybody has to go through on their own, which is why, back to what we said earlier, when you're doing the PhD, of course, there are periods of creative growth and other periods when you feel like throwing it all out of the window. And if you don't go through that, I think I'd be very suspicious, because, you can't...
That's what I say to my PhD students.
Otherwise just an automaton.
Throwing it out of the window.
We all have those days. A few more philosophical questions, if you like, just to wrap up. But would you say that your memories are predominantly positive?
Memories of what?
Anything. As you look back, as you survey your life with all the different nuances and all the paths.
Well, it's a mix, isn't it? I mean, I think my sort of academic memories, or my career memory, or my sort of intellectual path memories are all extremely positive, I think, apart from, some of the struggles I've had with the PhD or whatever. But basically, I think I've just been incredibly lucky in terms of where I am now and what I've been able to achieve, and the fact that I'm now doing exactly what I want to do, and I've achieved a very successful programme and, lovely community. I think that the sadder memories, or the more difficult memories, are the most emotional ones, really, kind of in my 20s, going through incredible sort of emotional angst because relationships not working. And I think that definitely the more difficult side of my life was the emotional side.
Yeah, I'm somebody who I think has often had a clearer sense of what I want career-wise, because I know that it's a comfort zone and I know what I'm good at, or I know at the end of the day I have to earn money, so I know what I need to do to get by. But I've often found it difficult not to be beholden to other people's narratives sometimes, and in relationships sometimes, you don't always find that you're able to express yourself clearly, and that binary, which I've always been quite keen to break down, has sometimes been an issue for me in my personal life rather than so much in my academic career. So there were periods when I felt I was wearing more than one hat, and I think I've moved on from that now, but it has been a struggle, and it's been with me for decades, if I'm honest.
Well, I think nobody really has I don't know many people who have a really easy ride in terms of kind of negotiating their relationship paths. I'm very lucky to have two amazing sons. They're now 23 and 25, and they are so independent and adventurous and absolutely amazing. And I have a very lovely partner too, who works here as a student mentor. So I feel eventually everything's sort of settled down, but it took quite a long time to get to that point. A mixture really, a mixture. But I think that's life, isn't it?
I think it is, because one of the other questions that I was going to ask is whether you can be nostalgic about negative experiences, because for me sometimes it's the things that don't work out that make you think, okay, how do I respond to that? And it's the old theodicy problem, the problem of evil. It's, okay, there's a situation here that's not good, it's not efficacious, it may not be very creative, but how do you respond to that? And I think sometimes I can look back on periods and I think, there's never been a period in my life when I could say was complacent, or I could say that everything was wonderful. But the wonderful thing is sometimes saying, okay, what resources do I have to respond to a particular threat or crisis or adversity, big or small? And it's that, knowing that, I did that 25 years ago, maybe I can recapture that essence now.
But also it's really learning from it, isn't it? And when I think of the most difficult emotional experiences I've had, they've all been there. And I can see much more clearly now than I did then, probably. They've all been there for me to learn something very, very important about myself. And I'm absolutely convinced that that's what kind of relationships are, whether they're with friends or partners or colleagues. It's to reflect something back to you, which may not always be very pleasant about yourself and the things you've got to grapple with. So I try and sit in that way, and I think some of the most difficult experiences I've had have definitely been there for a very particular reason. I've just learnt something about myself from them, most definitely, even though they're very unpleasant at the time, or traumatic at the time.
And it sounds like then that, in terms of the question of whether you feel that you've fulfilled the dreams you may have had when you were young, it sounds as though to a large extent you have, even if you wouldn't have imagined X number of decades ago that you'd be working in a university context perhaps, but you've managed to carry the interest in art and music through.
Yes, I feel that with these MA programmes I've managed to bring together everything I feel passionate about to the students and to the wider sort of context, and I'm now beginning to think of so I'm 61 now. I'm thinking, okay, what will be the after I finished, maybe in a few years' time, after I feel like moving on to something else, what will it be? I'm beginning to think, interesting to think about that. But I do feel I've achieved an amazing amount and been very, very lucky, and have reached a point of quite a lot of satisfaction.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've got one more question for you, which is whether you consider yourself a looking back or a looking forward type of person. Looking
forward, definitely looking forward. Yeah. And I enjoy this sort of meandering back into the past, but I think I'm always looking for the next. I'm always looking onto the next thing and the next project and the next phase of life.
No, the two often go in tandem, don't they? In order to look forward, you have to know. Often it's a case of learning about how before you've navigated unpleasant or uncertain episodes, but knowing that whatever happens, provided you have a clear sense of who you are and the direction that you're going in, it's going to be okay, rather than a complete leap into the unknown. Sometimes that can be good, but sometimes, of course, it can destabilise you and those closest to you. So you need to know where you can find balance.
Yes, and I think you have to trust that your soul knows. Actually, you have to trust that you. In an imaginative sense, that I like the idea that we choose our sort of destiny, before we appear in this world. So on some level we've chosen what we're going to do. Of course, there are lots of variables and lots of decisions to be made while we're here, but fundamentally there's a reason why we're in this life and we've chosen it, and that if we always go back to that trust that there's something in us that knows exactly why it's here and what it's here for, and try and just follow that, then that's the most important thing, and we will weather things on the way.
Angela Voss, thank you very much.
Thank you.